session is discussing the use of drugs, the choice, the role in society and the regulation of the use of drugs. It seems the human race has a very long history of a great interest in using natural products and chemical agents for healing, for birth control, for recreation, for control over each other, or just escape, whether it's temporary or whether it's permanent. We've now reached a point, though, where we've got an extraordinary array of agents and vast industries that underpin these various types of chemicals and drugs. They can save lives, they can destroy lives, and they can do lots of things in between. If you think, we've got legally prescribed medical agents, often used inappropriately, often overused at enormous cost to the taxpayer. Then we've got the so-called alternative medicines with extensive use in the community with much less documentation. We've got legal recreational drugs, alcohol, which itself is an enormous industry that's underpinned by our society. And then we've got illicit drugs. The regulation of all of this is just a maze of inconsistency, conflict, legal minefields. I was going to say dog's breakfasts, but it didn't quite fit. So it's all very, very disjointed. So we have 4 distinguished speakers this afternoon to take up various aspects of these very important problems, how we've got here and what some of the issues are in 2009. But I'd also like you as an audience to do some work, see if the contrasts, if the lessons, the common approaches emerge between how we're trying to handle these very different types of drugs in society. Well, our first speaker is Londa Schiebiger, who some of you will have heard earlier this afternoon. She's Professor of History of Science at Stanford and also the Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. And her work analyses interaction between gender, scientific knowledge, scientific institutions, and she's also particularly interested in the use of herbal remedies. We heard her speak earlier this afternoon on the use of herbal agents in the Caribbean in the 18th century, which was fascinating. And so we'll ask Londa to start and to set the scene. Thank you very much, Londa.
Hi, some faces in the audience are already familiar to me. I'm enjoying being here in Adelaide. So part of the title of this session is Choose Your Poison. I'm here in my role as historian to ask us to think further back and to think how our current situation is structured through hundreds of years in the ways that we organize our societies and that we think about medicine and we organize medical professions. One can choose their poison, but it's not always a matter of choice. We need to remember that drugs of whatever sort are developed within specific social and political contexts. We need to look at who develops what and for what purposes. Key questions here are how are universities structured, how are pharmaceuticals structured, who produces knowledge, how do we as a society set priorities to fund and develop certain fields of knowledge over others. We tend to romanticize, I think, the quest for knowledge and to assume that knowledge gained piles up in treasured chests of civilization. But what about knowledge lost? Knowledge not valued or knowledge ignored? Earlier this afternoon, I gave an example of agnotology. Agnotology is a term I and colleagues have coined to discuss the politics of knowledge. It defines the study of culturally induced ignorance and serves as a counterweight to traditional concerns for epistemology. So agnotology asks us to refocus questions of how we know to questions of what we do not know and why not. Drugs, the development of drugs essential to human health and well-being, also respond to political imperatives, professional struggles, disciplinary hierarchies, and much else besides. And in many instances, consumers cannot choose, and we need to look at what determines what gets on the market. So I want to look at these issues concretely through the example of the drug Savin, which over 300 years was an official drug in Europe, but in the course of the 19th century became classified as a poison. So this is very interesting to me, how we get from official drug to classified as a poison. This is important because Savin was an abortifacient of choice for women in Europe throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. So let me start with the story. Savin, or Junipera sabina, was used by European women to induce abortion, as a menstrual regulator, to expel afterbirth, or to expel dead fetuses. Women expressed the essential oil of the tips of the juniper tree and placed this in a warm drink. When ingested, it stimulates the smooth muscles of the uterus and can provoke strong contractions. Now, for several centuries, Savin was recognized as an official drug of Europe and listed in the pharmacopoeia, or the official drugs dispensed by pharmacists. Pharmacopoeias began appearing in an effort to regulate drugs in major cities in Europe from the 16th century onward, and Savin was included in these rather heavy Latin tomes. But whose knowledge was this? How did it develop, and who had access to it? Now, it's hard to know who originally developed Savin as an abortifacient, but it's clear throughout the 18th century that Savin belonged to women. Midwives administered it, and women used it. It was said that one could spot the midwife's house in a town when you entered a town because it was the one with the Savin tree in the garden. So Savin and other abortifacients, such as pennyroyal and rue, were widely used by women who often had free access to them and might learn to use them from their mother, from their neighbors, or the local midwife. From the 17th century until the last quarter of the 18th century, these drugs enjoyed the reputation of being effective, if dangerous. They were used with caution, and they were used widely. But this knowledge was increasingly vilified until, in the 19th century, Savin became reclassified as a poison. And this story is an interesting one because it gets at the heart of the question of people being able to choose or not choose their drugs. It gets to the point of what kind of access people have to drugs, what kind of fees are attached to drugs, what things cost, and who has power over them. So let me tell the story of how Savin became classified as a poison. There were two related developments. First, the midwives, who had been the keepers of this knowledge, were pushed out of the business of birthing. Medicine in the 18th century was becoming more scientific. We always celebrate the 17th and 18th century as the time of the scientific revolution. Increasingly, a university degree was required to practice medicine. Now, midwives were the first to ask for admission to universities, and they even attempted to set up professional schools of their own, but this was denied. Soon, midwives were pushed out of the more lucrative end of business by the unlikely character called the man midwife, and these men were eventually retitled gynecologists and obstetricians. Now, with the decline of midwifery, much knowledge was lost, and we need to look at how professions are structured and what impact this has on medical practices. Man midwives did not necessarily know how to administer Savin, even though they'd taken over this area of birthing. They were trained as surgeons and were not allowed to dispense drugs. Consequently, abortion became a surgical operation in the 19th century, and for this purpose, many new instruments were manufactured. Now, the second development of import was that in the late 18th century, Europeans began testing drugs in what we would today call clinical trials. Now, these are not the double-blind randomized tests that we have today, but medicine in the 18th century was becoming more critically scientific about how they used drugs. Drugs were increasingly tested in hospital settings and according to agreed-upon protocols. Edinburgh, Paris, and Vienna were centers of this testing. Now, were abortifacients, was Savin among the drugs tested? For the most part, no. These drugs were left unregulated, and they then became dangerous as midwives who had been expert in their use disappeared. Savin was also increasingly vilified. For a while it remained available in pharmacies, but these chemical samples of the essential oil were often falsified or contained no effective ingredient. When Savin was counterfeited, unsuspecting women took it with no effect, and Savin was soon said to be unreliable. It was said it did not work. And it's important symbolically that when Germans, for example, began cracking down on abortion in Europe had been legal throughout all of the 18th century, and then in the 19th century became illegal through centralized laws. So when the Germans, for example, started cracking down on abortion in the 1790s, symbolically they felled all the Savin trees in the public gardens, so no one would have access. So finally, in 1861, Savin was reclassified as a poison in England and elsewhere across Europe, and it became illegal. What we see then is that choice is often not freely available. What drugs are available and to whom has much to do with social values, has much to do with how professions are structured, who has access to them, has to do with state regulations, and much else besides. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Fran Baum. She's the Professor of Public Health at Flinders University here in Adelaide. She's very active nationally and with the World Health Organization, heavily involved in health promotion, but not just the measures for improved health, but how to motivate people, how to understand why they're adopted or neglected, if that's right. Thanks.
Right. Thanks very much, Chris. For this 10 minutes, I'm going to talk very much with my hat on as co-chair of the steering committee of the Global People's Health Movement, and I think you'll see why. Just to start with, how many of you have not, in the last year, taken an over-the-counter drug or a prescription drug? Oh, so I think that demonstrates how many people, how much drugs are part of our lives, when there was just, 2 or 3 people. And what I want to talk about particularly are probably the harms from 2 legal drugs, mainly about prescription medicine, but also a little bit about alcohol. And I want to focus on the role that multinational companies play in this, and particularly the way their investment in selling those drugs. Some of our biggest multinational companies are what's called big pharma, which means the big pharmaceutical companies. Novartis is worth 53,000 billion, which I think is 53 billion, amazing amount of money. If we look at the top 10 big pharma, their revenue equals 25% of Australia's GDP, so they're really big business. Much of their work is protected by the sort of network of trade-related governance we have globally, things like the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, known as TRIPS, an incredibly labyrinth, very hard to understand global system of regulation. But at the end of the day, what it does is give a very good deal to these large multinational companies. Often they say the drugs are expensive because of the research and development. But in fact, if you think about it, the public sector pays for much of the research and training of the scientific workforce and buys the pharmaceuticals. Estimates suggest that in fact the public sector pays for about 60% of funding for global health around the world. Yet the priorities of these pharmaceuticals R&D are largely shaped by the granting of patents to private corporations. And most of their research goes into drugs that will benefit the likes of us rather than people living in poor countries with tropical diseases. There's very little R&D in research on tropical diseases. And interestingly, and I think part of why we have to be concerned about the behaviour of these companies, is that their expenditure's been going up. In fact, it went up 147% between 1993 and 2004. But the number of approvals that they've got for new drugs has dropped from a peak of 53 in 1996 to 18 in 2007. So they're desperate multinational companies, I think you could conclude. And the other argument is, of course, that they have to have high prices because they pay for research and development. But a study by 2 Canadian researchers estimated that the US pharmaceutical industry spends almost twice as much on advertising as they do on research and development, which is, of course, contrary to the industry's claim. And in fact, in the US, in 2004, the industry spent $61,000. So imagine that, $61,000. Think about how much you earn and how much that is in relation to that, per physician in the US. So an astounding figure. The US, of course, uses lots of drugs. They represent approximately 43% of global sales and global promotion, and I think they're about 6% of the population. And of course, they really get to doctors with a range of incentives: dinners, sponsored conference attendances, free gadgets. If you're a doctor, I think it's very hard not to, in one way or another, have that sponsorship. I was very pleased that when we had the Psychiatry National Conference in Adelaide, 2 of our local psychiatrists, John Girodini and Malcolm Battersby, one of my colleagues at Flinders, withdrew from the organising committee of that conference because they didn't like the extent of Big Pharma sponsorship. So that link with advertising is massive. That's where I just want to pull in the points about alcohol, because there's a similar advertising industry behind alcohol. The best estimates in a report for the federal government last year, the social costs of alcohol were estimated to be over 15 billion. And that's in terms of accidents and missed days at work and so on. Yet our alcohol industries have massive advertising budgets to market a product that is, of course, is legal, but it's entirely self-regulated, that advertising. There is a code, and there is a group of which I happen to be a member that vets any complaints about that advertising, but it's very clear that it's stacked in favour of industry. And the people on the committee have your hands tied behind our backs because of the code. Whereas in fact, if you think about that cost to us, it's massive. And it would make a lot of sense if we were to properly regulate the advertising industry so that we didn't see attractive models, attractive images that really appeal to young people. The other issue that I want to mention in terms of the whole, going back to the marketing of drugs, is the whole issue of disease mongering. I think that's been very well described by the journalist Ray Moynihan, and of course it really builds on the work of Ivan Illich, who talked about the medicalisation of society. The first person who put forward the idea of disease mongering was Lynn Pear in the US, and she basically said that there was a sort of unholy alliance between, I guess, the new definition of diseases and the ways in which they were being widened in order to boost the demands for doctor services and new products, particularly pharmaceuticals. The examples of disease mongering might be a 5-year-old child who finds it difficult to sit still and can't concentrate. So do they suffer from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and should they be medicated with amphetamines? And those are the sorts of value questions, which I think they ultimately are, that we need to decide. A middle-aged man with occasional sexual difficulty, should he have a new condition described as erectile dysfunction, and should he be taking expensive new pills? And of course, is menopause a disease, or is it part of something that happens as you get older? And to what extent should you use drugs, particularly when the evidence on their effectiveness is not as strong as it has been claimed to be in the past? And of course, all this ends up in our rising health budgets, which we'll be talking about in this room later tonight. Now, the final thing I want to turn to before I conclude is the effects on low-income countries. Because in low-income countries, people's, of course, their need for health services is far greater than ours because they die earlier and they suffer from many more diseases. I've learnt very much here from my colleagues in the People's Health Movement, which is full of amazing people who have worked with their communities to advance the rights to health right across the world, in Latin America, Africa and Asia. And one of my colleagues is Dr. Zafrullah Chowdhury, and he's worked in Bangladesh to establish in his own health centre his own pharmaceutical manufacturing plant, but also to struggle against Big Pharma to establish a rational drug policy in his country. And that's been going on since he was a freedom fighter in the Bangladeshi War of Independence. One of his aims has been to establish a rational drug policy. Now, he's written up his struggle in a book called The Politics of Essential Drugs, and Susan George, the well-known environmental activist, wrote in a preface, "In the so-called Third World, this vast realm of the underregulated and the overexploited, the sway of the drug companies is virtually beyond belief. No country is too poor, no market too insignificant. The pharmaceutical giants defend their interests on every front against all corners." And what Zafrullah has shown is that if you can stand up to that, and he points out what a long, hard battle it is, but he knows that the need for essential drugs are very clear, and that local production can result in financial savings to low-income countries, and it will save countless lives if drugs are affordable. Susan George, in that same preface, she does note, and she says, doctors are at the mercy of drug companies and are, quote, constantly plied by the companies with a plethora of juicy inducements in many forms, free travel, stipends, gifts, opportunities for obligations for which the all-encompassing word is bribes. Now, just to finish, I think it's worth putting at some wins. So as I say, Zafrullah, my colleague, heads a wonderful centre known as GK, located in Savah, just outside Dakar, where they do manufacture their own essential drugs. There's been a wonderful treatment action campaign started in South Africa that's resulted in far cheaper drugs for HIV/AIDS for people in Africa. Countries such as Brazil and India are manufacturing cheaper drugs and selling them to other low and middle-income countries. I just heard yesterday on email that on Thursday, India made what will probably be a very significant decision against Novartis, who had made an application for a patent on a drug that was just a minor modification of an earlier drug for treating blood cancers. They claimed that they could exert a patent over this new drug, but the Indian court has decided that it will not give patents to new forms of known substances, only to new substances. And that's a really, really significant win that happened in India this week. The other thing I was really pleased to hear about from my colleague Malcolm Battersby is that our medical students in Australia have formed a group called Pharmax, which is an independent campaign, and they have a petition for students to sign up, identifying themselves as pharma-free, pledging not to accept gifts, promotional materials and fundings from pharmaceutical companies during their training or in the future. So prescription drugs are an area that I think we need to be concerned about as much as the drugs that we label illicit. I think countries have to regulate large companies that produce them, and certainly in Australia we have a great pharmaceutical benefits scheme that has kept the price of drugs down. But we also need a World Trade Organization which is reformed and which governs in the interests of people and the public and cheap drugs, rather than in the interests of the profits of private companies. So I think rather than pushing the limits on this one, what we want are governments that will really set the limits for these pharmaceutical companies, and that will be in the interests of all our health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran. This really is a critical issue in our society, the amount of overuse and misuse, just thinking of antibiotics, for instance. And it's the sort of elephant in the room in a way that it doesn't have attention drawn to it as much as it should. I'd just like to remind you to remember any questions that you want to ask Fran until later. Now, our third speaker is Simon Singh. I'm sure a lot of you will have heard him already or heard him on the radio today. He has a PhD in physics from Cambridge. He then became a very successful author, science broadcaster, committed to communication and education in science. His latest book looks critically at use of alternative medicines. If this wasn't enough, he's very recently achieved notoriety by being sued by the Chiropractors Association of UK for an article in The Guardian. I hope you don't mind me saying this, Simon. So this afternoon we're hearing about alternative medicines, which is another very big sleeper in our society. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. I thought, obviously, I'd talk about alternative medicine, and I I thought I'd talk about it from the point of view of what are the risks. People look at alternative medicine and they tend to say it's natural, and if it's natural, it must be safe. If it's traditional, if it's been used for thousands of years, it must be safe. And I just wanted to examine that and look at a few therapies to look at the risk and benefits that they offer, to see whether the benefits outweigh the risks, if indeed there are any risks. And so starting at the most positive end, there are some alternative therapies such as meditation for the relief of anxiety, hypnotherapy for treating irritable bowel syndrome. Both seem to be backed up with some evidence, and both seem to carry very few risks. So although I've been criticised as being anti-alternative therapy, and my co-author as well, Edzard Ernst, have been criticised as being anti-alternative therapy, I don't think that's true. I think we're pro-evidence. And in this case, the evidence for risk is low, the evidence for benefit is significant, and therefore we have something that we'd be happy to promote and endorse. And then we can move down the spectrum. So at the one end of the spectrum, we've got things like meditation, hypnotherapy, and so on. If we move down, we've got something like acupuncture. With acupuncture, the interest in acupuncture in China dates back thousands of years, but in the West it became popular in the early 70s when Nixon went to China. Just prior to Nixon's visit, there was another American visit, and part of the press corps was a chap called James Reston, a very respected New York Times journalist. And while James Reston was in Shanghai, he suffered an appendicitis, I think, had an operation. The operation went fine, but he had severe stomach pains afterwards. And he was lying in his bed and was shocked to find that somebody came into his room, started inserting very fine needles into his knee to relieve the pain in his stomach, which then miraculously subsided. Never heard of acupuncture before, never seen an acupuncturist before, but went back to New York, wrote it up in glowing terms, and then there was this sudden fascination in acupuncture, and doctors would suddenly go from the West to China to learn about this miraculous technique. And then there were clinical trials conducted, comparing different groups of patients to see whether acupuncture really could deliver the claims that were made for it. There have been dozens, in fact, probably hundreds of clinical trials on acupuncture. The idea being that you insert very fine needles into the body. The Chinese philosophy is that there are meridians running through our body carrying qi. When those meridians get blocked, when the flow of qi is blocked, that's when we become ill. Inserting the needles at the correct points allows the qi to flow, and we then feel better. Now, what happens when you test this? Well, what you do is you take 100 patients with a condition, you give them acupuncture, real acupuncture, and then you have another 100 patients and you give them fake acupuncture. Now, what can fake acupuncture possibly be? Well, what you would do is, in this group, you would put the needles in very specific places where the acupuncture books would tell you to insert the needles. With this group, you stick them in anywhere, randomly. And what happens is that this group of patients over here, for pain, various pain conditions, various types of nausea, this group seemed to show some benefit. But this group also shows a benefit. What this implies is that meridians don't really exist, qi doesn't really exist, and that putting in the needles seems to be what benefits the patient. But is it a real effect, or is it just a placebo? I don't want to dismiss the placebo effect because it's very powerful and very useful. But is it a placebo effect we're seeing, the ritual of the needles, the expectation, or is there something more specific that can be identified?